All right, so I was trying to have it all together before I started and hit live. I'm almost there, but I'm a little like, I ran to the mailbox because I needed to get my mail from yesterday, and I ran into a new neighbor of mine, and we got to chatting and just kind of reinstilled, like, not only do I have to go live at 10 a.m. and talk about something, but just the necessity. It may not be someone's like personal problem of dealing with mental health or addiction, which I would debate since we all got a brain, so we all got to take care of it. But the conversation I had with him was just like that. One, it was new because I had never really met him before. It ends up that we're both work in healthcare, but it's just the magnitude of some of the things that are happening. So he was telling me how his car was just broken into, literally right outside of my apartment. And there's really no degree of discrimination at this point where we're being affected by suffering. Everyone is experiencing it at every different level. And just had to get that off my chest because I had just had that conversation. And I was like, wow, like never I ceased to be amazed by the degree of chaos happening and disorganization and inflammation going on at any given time. Thankfully, you know what? If you had caught my lives a year ago, I openly and vulnerably shared that I sold my nice car in an effort to like make a financial move for myself. I didn't want a car payment. And to be honest with you, kind of the protective factor is it's not as lucrative to take for someone to take from me, because I sold the nice one. And by no means does that mean go sell your nice cars. Everyone's allowed to have, your nice things, especially if you worked for them. And, it just kind of like makes me grateful a little bit that I was like, you know what? If it happens, it happens. I got insurance, but it's like I'm not really losing something that I'm so attached to because I'm not only paying large amounts of money for it, like I was, when I have a $400 car payment. But I'm also like willing, because I have allowed myself to, not in preparation for someone to steal my car, but I have allowed myself to kind of surrender an attachment to, if something of material was lost, then I would still be okay. And that, I think everyone understands fundamentally that we're going to be okay if we lose something, but then we're hit with the unexpected loss. And the chemical imbalance that comes with dealing with a stressful event, having to call the insurance companies, having to do all the little things. And that's just a lot. And so I'm going to start today's talk with a couple of disclaimers. One, since I just came from outside and talking to my neighbor, just be mindful that, like, you're going through something, someone else is going through something, and we're all going through a lot of things right now in the world that is making it really difficult for us to connect. It's making it difficult for us to understand and listen to ourselves and to other people. And it's contributing to the suffering of overall, like, what we're trying to at least slow down in the mental health world. So another little disclaimer for today's topic is that it could be a trigger warning. Or I guess it is a trigger warning, but it could be a trigger for someone who is going through and understanding their own trauma. I'm actually just going to film just on Facebook today, just because I don't want there to be any misconceptions of having different platforms being streamed, and because it's a tough topic for people. And I told myself when I first started these talks, and most of them were to build my content library for my program, which I've been successful with, but I didn't want to go into like the bigger topics that require a lot of guidance and a lot of counseling, like boundaries, surrendering, sobriety, and what that looks like. I've been talking about things around those concepts to help people start to be able to make those conversations more manageable. But today I wanted to talk about suffering because surrendering. Because it is one of more of the pivotal points of intention and how we go into the next moment, let alone the next hour, the next day, the next thing that we want to do, whether it's a task, whether it's a whole project that we're taking on. And I think it's a very tough topic for people because of the misconceptions of it being a negative thing and it leading to powerlessness. And so I wanted to open that up, and I'm also going to share a story that I'm not sure if anyone else is going to be able to relate, but it's when I think of what my relationship with surrendering has been in terms of my experience, and that can be what the triggering part is. There's going to be a lot of triggering things that can be talked about in this, so I just want to give people a heads up as to be mindful of, like, what do you do when you're triggered? Making sure you breathe for the most part. And if anything, having something to write with and to reflect with that trigger is because your body is reacting to something that you've been affected by before. And to really consider that this is a time for you to lean into the trigger, not be driven away by it, and really see whether or not there is a topic of or a focus that you need to have in your own healing when this topic is brought up. So, oh boy, let's get into it. So I'm gonna try to be short too, because I say that every time, setting my intention. Let's be brief, okay? So I gave myself a little bit of an outline, and I'm gonna try to be brief. So why did this come up? Well, I don't know about you. This week it happens to be February 16th today. So 2 days ago was February 14th. And as much as I have worked on myself and the development of self-love, the confidence that I have of being alone doesn't always mean lonely, a lot of this had to do with surrendering to my old definitions of what love, and then Valentine's Day as, you know, usually just a point of reference in our macro shared experience and worldview of what love actually is, quote unquote, supposed to be. And so previous years, surrendering looks different for everyone and in every situation. But the biggest thing comes up is just everyone get into conflict of like, oh, this is what you should do. This is what you're supposed to do. Men in relationships and women and men in relation, or just partnerships in general. You know, you're supposed to be asking Valentines to be Valentines, da 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 da. And those debates aside, I was like, what is a concept that intersects with this? And for me, this year, I have, I've been okay. I'm single. Like, let's just go put it out there, because I have been on this journey for myself to understand that, like, okay, I'm going to be okay if no one else is able to quite be at the place where love and being intentional about loving me, that I'm going to be okay because I can do that. And so my own journey of whether health journey, mental health journey, weight loss, whatever the frig you want to call it, has had to include surrendering. Why? Is because in any given moment, we have expectations, and intellectually, we can determine what those expectations are in dynamics in conversations with other people. But very rarely do we realize there's a whole other world of expectations that we don't know about. And that's the internal expectation of emotion, that we are never going to know how we're going to feel for sure. We can predict how we're going to feel, like, oh, if something like this happens to me, I know I'm going to feel A, B, and C. So there's a prediction, and that it is going to increase. It's an intention that you're setting there. It's going to increase the chances that those things happen. But there's also the chance that there's going to be something else that you don't know to happen, because we can't necessarily always tell the future. Can we predict it? Yes. But is it going to be 100% accurate? Maybe, maybe not. We get lucky sometimes. And so surrendering for me this year came in the sense of, like, I had set my list of intentions of all the work I was going to do. And I knew that there's already a surrendering concept of surrendering in setting my intentions and then not being in control of anything outside of myself. So what ultimately happened was I woke up, had set my intentions the day before. I was practicing what I preach, being prepared to be productive. And then I wake up Wednesday morning and I have this heaviness on my chest. And I was like, oh shit, excuse my language. What's happening here? And I had no idea. Gonna try to keep this professional. I had no idea that I was going to miss my father and my cat that I just recently had to put down in November so much. And I had to surrender to my own emotion. And so when we talk about surrendering, a lot of people, we can't even really get to this conversation. And I actually even had this conversation with my own therapist. And she brought up the fact, it's like, well, I don't really like surrendering because it leads with this negative concept. And I absolutely agree with you. It's negative to feel. There could be some negative feelings. And I already gave a trigger warning at the beginning of this, that it's going to present you with a negative concept when you first consider it. A lot of associations in the conversations I've had from my own clients where they perceive like, well, surrendering is giving up my power. Surrendering is leaving me at a disadvantage. Surrendering is weakness. And I, as a pillar of hope, and can't tell you exactly where it comes from other than the fact that I've seen people use this concept once they can get through the barrier of that bias of what the associated negativity with this one word can be, changes their lives. And it has changed my life. So I was presented with having to surrender to my own emotional roller coaster that I was hit with, and I really had to delay a lot of my day. Some of it also had to do with the fact that I was off routine. I had worked pretty late on Tuesday night, so before that 14th on Wednesday. So therefore, I kind of lopsided myself. I usually end up in the gym to kind of get my regulation going in the morning and mentally like be able to manage. And I don't typically do that on Wednesdays because I have clients that start at 9 a.m., which I had a client on Wednesday and I showed up for, but I was, I was out of whack. I'm not going to lie to you. Not to the point where I really needed to cancel the session, but to the point where I was a representation of who I am trying to help. Like I was not the patient that day. I didn't talk about myself. I was able to hold space for my client, but we actually held space for each other. And that was ultimately, I think, the blessing of me being able to lead with vulnerability. And what I want people to realize, that vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is not shame. It's actually the superpower. But it also has to be learned and it has to be practiced, because there's a lot of different representations of what vulnerability is, and they're not necessarily wrong, but sometimes just more undeveloped, because we tend to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is part of surrendering. We tend to be vulnerable out of our own control when we're in emotions, and we try to mask those emotions. We try to push them aside because we have to show up for something. We have to show up for something else, a meeting, and that's not something that you have to do with vulnerability. There's a purpose for wearing that mask if you have to be present and you can't just like openly be emotional. But part of learning and practicing vulnerability is building that emotion into your narrative, being mindful of it so that if you can't change around your schedule for the day, that you can shift around how you express emotion into your words, into your actions. And this is how we're practicing mindfulness helps a lot of people be able to acknowledge that we're in authenticity and now we're in vulnerability of being able to build expression and emotion into how you operate in the day. So how I did that, and so the first point I wanted to be is the serenity prayer. Now, this is a prayer where when I start working with my clients, most of them are averse to any type of religion. A lot of people have come from very restrictive religious principles within their families. At one point, I was in this weird gray area of being agnostic, that I didn't really know what higher power or if there was even a higher power, right? So it doesn't really matter what your faith belief system is at any given point. Where the serenity prayer comes in is, it has the word God in it, but if you go check out in the app, I have my own rendition of serenity. Oh gosh, I completely missed the chat. You guys are like killing it there. I was so focused. But in the app, I have my own rendition of the Serenity Prayer where just it's like a Mad Lib. You insert whatever thing you cannot control sometimes, and sometimes it's your own self. So if you need to start with your journey of you being the higher power of like, I surrender what control I'm trying to have over my own self right now and trying to regulate and force myself to do something, that Serenity Prayer is a very good coping skill, reminder, action, whatever you want to call it, to align yourself back with what you can control. So if you're not familiar with it, it's God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I have had days where I have had to recite that, like for sometimes hours of just in the back of my mind, accept the things I cannot control, courage to change the things that I can, wisdom to know the difference. So in this concept of surrendering, we now have other principles that will guide us to not being powerless. So if we can get past the barrier of bias and it being a negative concept, surrendering actually brings you, it's like a little trap door to a journey of you actually being able to focus on what you can control. So from a physiological perspective, this is where I help people understand like what happens to your body under a stress response. Your brain goes offline. Just consider it like your Wi-Fi dropped. You're like, what the heck? Why can't I think? Why can't I do anything? That is your fight, flight, freeze, fawn stress response. We're all given it. Happy birthday. It's yours. You can't throw it away. So sorry, you got to figure out how to use it to your advantage and how one ways to use it. Sometimes we have to retrain it, but a lot of times we have to recondition that when it's activated, insert new things. So one of those things is for a lot of my clients, I encourage is the Serenity Prayer because it's just so easy and adaptable to be able to redirect to a thought process that is not part of your fundamental belief system. We're not trying to battle with the power in which you want to have over your reality at that point in time. But the longer you battle with it, the longer it's going to take to get back to the same part of your journey where you actually have to make the decision. So once you surrender, it's like, oh, this day is not going like I thought it would be like. All right, I surrender, figure out what's next. You have this opportunity. You also, it's naturally kind of self-soothing your stress response in a way to be able to get your brain back online, overcome that stress response, and also recondition it to a direction where it's actually going to help you in the future. So we're preparing now. But we can't really get there until you consider, why does surrendering always lead to feeling powerless? And because if you can't get through that barrier, then you're not going to be able to get to what I'm talking about at this point. But so the Serenity Prayer requires intention. It requires you to be, and pull it up. I'm trying to think, where's my, I have a copy of it usually somewhere in my vicinity to remind me, but it's also to the point where I've memorized it to that degree. Now, some people, we have other prayers you can do. If that works for you, that's fine. But if you're trying to figure out why you can't be consistent and feel connected in your own life, then I would encourage you to come away from something that has been conditioned and been working for so long and see whether or not something else will actually help boost your coping mechanisms. And this is where we work on, how do you optimize your resources? And this has nothing to do with just money or anything else. This has everything to do with all your energy. And so behaviorally, we have to start trying new things because your brain is a natural deviant. It's looking for ways to be efficient. It's looking for ways to protect you. And if you're not looking for ways to help it do that, then it's going to go work on its own. And so anything that you experience is going to happen to you and not happen for you. So this is where a lot of people I've found get stuck in what recovery, obviously, like more from substance recovery, but any type of change and consistency, because people expect that once you do, you can start the behavior, you can start eating healthier, but how come it's not built into the lifestyle? I know I struggled with this immensely for the first part of my life. And when I really realized, it's like, you know what, I'm just going to take it day by day, and I'm going to surrender to my own expectations and really truly listen to what I'm going through at every given point in time. Yes, it's exhausting, but you know what else is exhausting? Trying to make a change and sustain it without having the proper resources and foundation to actually sustain it. So I frustrated myself, I damaged myself, and I re-traumatized myself by trying the fad diets, by trying the detoxes, by trying to do the shortcuts and not the full assignment. So there's a lot more to this topic, but I just feel like surrendering is such a expansive concept that we need to break it down a little bit. So what is the biggest barrier other than bias before we even get to surrendering? Now, in my opinion, and this is where I would encourage people to share your opinions, what is your barrier, right? To me, the primary barrier is always going to be shame. A lot of the times that bias of like, oh, it's so negative comes from the shame of like being in a position where we have been traumatized, where we have had something taken from us. And that is and shame has, and a lot of that happens in very micro ways, where microaggressions kind of gets its origination from is being invalidated by a parent. No one has to hit you or slap you across the face or physically assault you to invalidate you and disrespect and make you take your dignity away as a person. But in parenting, shame is one of the most effective tools. I know it because I can't speak to my mother's intention, but when it was done to her, the only thing she knows as a parent is to do that to me too. And it was a very good way to reinforce attention and behavior. However, it's short term. It is not a long-term solution. Shame is a short-term emergency only. Get your emotional attention reinforced to stop a negative behavior. But long-term, it is not sustainable. It leads to perfectionism, which leads to burnout, which leads to depression, which leads to destruction of people's lives because they don't know how to break out of that. And that relationship with shame is pivotal for people to explore, understand, and eventually reconstruct a new relationship with shame. It's not going anywhere. I wish it could just be like, I wish all emotions in itself can be like, yeah, just go ahead and extract this. I don't want this anymore. Take those, put them elsewhere. Unfortunately, it's not possible. And any attempt that we're going to make to do that will reconstruct and deconstruct humanity, in my opinion. If you want to even consider a visual representation or creative representation of this, the movie Eternal, of course I'm going to forget the name. Eternal Minds of the Spotless Mind. Hold on, Google, hold on. Jim Carrey was in it. Eternal Sunshine of the Mind, or of the Spotless Mind, where ultimately what they were doing was removing parts of his memory of love and to try to help him heal. But then the brain is just kind of doing that. So there's so many different representations that actually that movie hits on in terms of mental health and neuroscience that I think great. Maybe one day I'll do an episode. I did a podcast episode recently on narrative therapy with certain movies and how you can use movies to inspire you. Use creations that we have had in people's creative outlets as momentum for change in your life. I'll let you guys know when that's released. But we've tried another visual representation of not necessarily surrendering, but if it's resisting surrendering and acknowledging that suffering is part of the human existence, it's part of growth. So if you ever watch Black Mirror, the first season, it's the episode Archangel. Now, trigger warning for that. It's an intense episode for someone, even myself as a trauma-informed therapist and recovery specialist, that like, it's a lot, but it gives a very good visual of how if we make efforts to restrict ourselves from trauma, if we take trauma away from this world, us as humans will be naturally curious enough to figure out what suffering is and create, because it basically has, I don't want to spoil the episode for you, but go watch it. It should be still on Netflix. Black Mirror Archangel is that episode. But when we go through trying to eradicate shame, trying to eradicate something from existence, even the bad things, like even the flesh-eating bacteria, it has its purpose for us to develop. If we didn't have venomous snakes, we wouldn't have antidotes. If we didn't have fear, we wouldn't have courage. If we didn't have trauma, then we wouldn't have triumph. Sorry, it's corny, but it's true. And it's a little cliche, but it is part of that process. So how do we understand and learn to navigate not only the spiritual side of that? So, and spiritualists are very much in purpose to help people understand that realm, but you have to understand the materialistic and the mortal realm as well. And you have to understand how this works, and you have to understand how this works to work together to be able to get to, and all of those principles working together. So shame is one of the biggest barriers for why people cannot surrender. Now, I'm going to just go into hopefully a quick story, which I'm going to be honest with you, this is where my relationship with surrendering really, and why I was like, no, this is actually a really pivotal part of my program. And it's an experience that I'm not sure a lot of people, they may not be able to relate to. It could be a trigger for a lot of people of color, just as a heads up. And honestly, just anyone with an opinion, they can come for me for this. So let me get a drink of water before I do that. So when I was working in the prison system, most people think I was working they could, I don't know. If you know me well enough, my story, I wasn't a counselor by role. I was actually a correctional officer in a all-male maximum security prison. This was after an undergrad, before grad school, took a year off, a gap year. And I was more in the criminal justice side of my experience at that point before I found what clinical social work really was. And in there, you go through training. Not everyone, in order to actually be on the floor in the prison, you don't necessarily need to go to basic training to learn weapons and to learn maneuvers and all that. But they're going to expedite if you're, in a position where you need those skills. So for the first 10 months, I worked in operations. And then I was fine in operations being just kind of like standard internal, booths, opening doors, operate. And then my brain is just, I like to be busy. So I actually ended up doing a lot of the counts and the inmate logging and transfers and stuff like that, because I needed more to do than just pushing a button. But when I was pushing the button, it was when I was actually studying for my, I guess I don't know if I should acknowledge that, but I was studying for my MAT, the master's level entry test. So, and so eventually I already knew I had gotten into my program. I knew I was leaving within like about 5 months is by the time I was accepted. And, they sent me to basic training school at that point. Now, I knew it was coming because as a person of my stature, I'm 6 feet tall. I also have the broadness of a man that in those roles and in that prison is going to be beneficial. And there's not a lot of women that were willing to do that. Can't even tell you why I was willing. I'm just a curious person. So I was like, yeah, I'll see what it's like to work in a prison. And then So long story short, I got trained, and as soon as I got done, they put me on what we call gray unit, which is long-term segregation. Everyone basically in the cell for 23 hours, either administratively or they had a charge that was very, very traumatic for people. And so I was involved in a use of force probably within the first month of being placed on this. This is the first use of force I have ever been involved in. I've been there for a year at this point. I'm like, oh my gosh, training kicked in the best as possible. And what happened was, it was a older gentleman, not necessarily like elderly, but he was known to throw feces and substances on the officers and other inmates, which is what we called gassing. And this was not something that I really wanted to have done to me. So when he went, we were removing him from one location and moving him back somewhere else. He's in handcuffs, all that. And I was involved I think it was like 3 or 4. I think I was the only female. We had to bring him down to the ground. And we had to have a use of force. It was, for the most part, pretty standard protocol. However, in the process, I was on his upper shoulder. So this is my left shoulder. So, and I apparently hurt him to the point where I guess the use of force was not out of control, but enough that it caused bruising. It caused, some degree of hurt and harm. So when I think of surrendering, this story is where I come back to, because at that point, I had never been in a position where I had been influencing harm. I'm a healthcare provider. I try to reduce harm, right? And at this point, I have been not really in my career. So it's like I hadn't really fully subscribed to that, but I was a perpetuator of a power dynamic on someone else. Maisie, I'm telling a story here, Maisie. Okay. So when you don't have a lot of experiences to understand carrying out a power dynamic, it's going to be very difficult to understand being on the receiving end of one. And so I had to, I recall that story as a moment of empathy where I was like, as part of my job, as part of my role, I had to force surrender on someone, because what we're trained to say in those situations, because it's natural for this person who's getting manhandled to resist, my narrative is stop resisting. So it wasn't really till I had reflected on that as an experience did I really understand in my own way that I perpetrated surrendering, and I also had to be in a position of surrendering. Because if I fought with myself, so on this side of it, the way I think about it, right, is as a perpetrator and forcing someone else to surrender and me not surrendering, I completely invalidate my experience of potentially being in a threatening position where my life could be significantly altered if that person did have a weapon. I think the situation was, like I said, he was what we call a gasser. So he was going for something to assault someone with. But then also being an empathetic person, could I put myself in the shoes of this man? And I believe, I don't remember exactly his race, I just know he was a person of color, in a position where you have your physical movement taken from you, and in a situation where you were forced to surrender and had a situation where you were taken from. Now, where I said this could be a trigger warning is that I'm using this example as hopefully like a lesser impact. It's still a huge impact because this is law enforcement, and the conversations and the realities that people of color are more inclined to experience something like this. But anyone can experience something like this where you've had something taken from you. And in order for me to really understand the magnitude of how to use surrender to my own existence, I have to include both sides. I have to include the experience of when I have been a perpetrator of taking and forcing someone else to surrender, and then also having my own experiences of having to surrender unintentionally as well as intentionally. So it's both, if not three, dynamics or intersections of our relationship with what surrendering means. So I hope that makes sense. Like I said, I'm not really sure if that story is going to have its magnitude with other people to be able to relate what kind of things, shame, can be a barrier for understanding how much of an intentional and needed aspect of recovery and coming back from all of the trauma that our society has experienced, and every individual in their own way, as to surrendering is not only something that's happened to us, we've done it to other people, because when we have to choose our reality, our needs over someone else's, that's survival. And a lot of the times it feels like we're taking something from someone to the other person, as well as how are you going to use both of those occurrences of having to surrender and perpetuating taking from someone else to your advantage. And when I say advantage, I don't mean like in a greedy way. I just mean in a way where you're not stuck in shame. Excuse me. You're not stuck in the cycle of self-sabotage, which is perpetuated by shame because of a potential experience with being a taker. And now a lot of people ask me like, well, how do you figure out the takers of the world? That's another conversation for another time. But I will say part of this conversation and what conversations you're going to be willing to have will show you who is more of a taker than a giver. And when I use taker and giver, it's just, it's, if you were to talk about this in trendy, people using clinical terms in different ways that are not how they mean, narcissism, codependency, that's usually the most common form, taking and giving. But I just use taker giver because most of us are empathetic, we're over empathizing, and people are taking advantage of that. And that's not the person taking advantage of that's problem. It's ours. It's our own individual boundary that needs to be set for ourselves, not to keep takers away, but for you to have protection over yourself and paying attention to yourself, knowing where you stop and another person starts, where your experience is your own perspective, and someone is naturally going to see it a different way because they experienced it differently. That man that I had a use of force with experienced it. I'm not going to I don't label people's trauma, but I would imagine since I hurt him, and the aftermath of that experience was that I had a hit out on me, which we call a shit hit. Excuse me. We're adults here at this point. So, and even the children are using that word, but it was because it was feces. And so it wasn't someone he was out to get me enough to the point where other inmates that I had more of a professional rapport with as an officer assured me that they were working on it for me. Now, I didn't, I took that as a form of validation, that there was a professional relationship there with, but I didn't expect it. I wasn't going to just go, but I didn't go back around him. I didn't taunt him. I didn't put myself in front of a person that I had hurt. And at that point, I wasn't doing it intentionally. I really honestly just because I had no idea what I was doing. But in hindsight, it was something that really shaped what I had to go through in order for me to find my own program and figure out what it is. And I didn't really know it was surrendering at the time, but it gave me that perspective of how I have been a taker. I have been a taker of someone's comfort. I've been a taker of someone's suffering. I guess I'm giving suffering at that point, but I've been a taker of someone else's, and I've impacted people negatively. And there will be times in the future where that I can anticipate, just statistic-wise, to impact people negatively, but my goal is to counteract it and with some balance, because I am mindful that I'm going to do it. So therefore I can be prepared of how to have someone, whether it's be intentional about making sure that I am clear in how I give people feedback. I am clear with how I, handle myself and delivering difficult conversations and being mindful to people's experience of that. However, I also have to build in there that there's going to be situations where I have no other choice but to protect myself. And that is a really tough thing. So mind you, this is like, we started out here on the crust of like when we're approaching what surrendering means, to understanding how do we actually cope with it? How do we heal with it? Because it's going to have a story. And it's going to have a narrative that you have to read, and it's your past and your experiences where you've had something taken from you and you have been a taker. And so until we do that, then can we talk about acceptance? Because a lot of times I was talking with my therapist about this, and surrendering, especially when we're dealing with trauma, and especially with a lot of women, since this tends to happen more in the history of like women's rights, where sexual assault, rape, all of that is perpetuated. It's not just happening to women, it happens to men as well. But it's very painful to acknowledge that we have to forgive, or we have to surrender in the moment, and or in our healing to the trauma that happened to us. And it's very delicate. It's not something that you rush through, but I also have to be mindful, and just disclaimer is that this is what most people avoid in addressing their health, is that sometimes you have to go back through some of the old chapters and rewrite the narrative to include what you could control and what you could not. And that is painful for a lot of people, but it's also something that you don't have to do alone. Especially if you find a good therapist and they know what they're doing, and you have vetted them, and you're not just sharing your trauma out there. You're not just like, hey, this is it. We make joke of it, and I love to joke and make light of really heavy topics in my sessions, but I also have to be mindful when I'm actually reinforcing someone else's and my own, when I do this in my own therapy sessions, our own discomfort with emotion, and it triggers intellectualization versus actually experiencing the energy that gets trapped in us and perpetuates the problems and the symptoms that we're having. So, it's a big topic. Now, how do you, I had mentioned, like, okay, part of, this concept comes down into, like, why is surrendering important? A lot of the times it is one of the initial things that you have to get good at when you're trying to do something different. So for a lot of people in domestic violence relationships, you have to surrender to the fact that you can't fix the relationship. There will not be anything that you can do to change that other person and their behavior to stop taking your dignity away. Does not mean surrendering to continue to let it happen. It means surrendering to the fact that you can only control how you react and what you do about it. And so that is where a lot of the time surrendering requires us to work on how we release ourselves from those dynamics, from those power dynamics. Now, here's the other part of therapy that I do with people, is that those power dynamics are not just in the relationships that we have with other people. They're ingrained in us. They are power dynamics between our parent and our child ego states. So this is what my program is really kind of a community about, is naturally finding a balance between those internalized power dynamics that we have that are triggered by our stress response, that are producing ineffective symptoms, procrastination, accountability, conflict, anger issues, that a lot of it is addressing the power dynamic and surrendering to what you can't control the automatic thought to be in order to redirect it to a new narrative. And so when we are in denial, and this is where I'm not going to try to wake up anyone out of denial. If I hear it in their narrative, I was like, I just accept it. That's where acceptance comes in. Acceptance releases us from what we've already surrendered and acknowledged, that we're not going to get into a power dynamic with someone else's parent and child ego state and exhaust ourselves to the point where our power dynamic becomes even more exhausting for us to handle. So when we see people in that denial, if they're denying existence or denying your feelings, you're up against a taker, either in that moment or consistently someone who has not worked on balancing taking and giving. If you're working your life and trying to be hustle culture, this is where I'm skirting the line right now, because this is just all I know how to do. But I'm trying to put the energy that I have when I'm younger, because I know naturally that energy is going to decline over time if I do not take care of myself. I'm working more than I am experiencing some things that maybe a 34-year-old would be out traveling. But I've done travel. I did that. Thankfully, my mom, she knew something. She brought us to other cultures early on. So I have that, and I will have that experience more once I'm not finished, but once I put towards and building what I know my contribution and what I want my legacy to be, right? So, but if you're working and not feeling, you're in a power dynamic. Like I was talking about, my own experience with surrender this week was I had to surrender to the emotion of missing loved ones on a day of love and being emotional about it versus throwing myself into my to-do list. Now, once I did that, I was able to work a little bit longer, and I was able to address, I got like 60% of the things that I needed to get done. I was quite impressed with myself. But when we're not able to surrender to our own power dynamic of accountability and what we feel like is expected of us and what we're supposed to do or what we should be doing, then we prolong the inevitable. We waste energy. If you are in a business, you have a whole department that's constantly going through, how do you reduce resources, money being spent, energy being spent? How do you reduce costs so you can continue to support the growth of your employees, of your goal, of your mission, and your purpose of that company, right? And we don't do that for ourselves. We don't take that inventory of like, okay, where's my energy going? Because if you have thought tabs open, you are not surrendering. You're not surrendering as walking away from the tabs being open for that moment, not forever, but it's surrendering the expectation that they get done now, more is another one where we're not surrendering. More is going to come. More is the future. And if you're packing it full of, I want more, I am more, I should be more, I need to be more, it's not sustainable. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to give up your hopes and dreams, but it means that you have to do some reprioritization of your expectations, and your expectations come back to your emotion, because that's all. It's desire. It's understanding truly what is desire and what is necessity. And change will eventually happen, and you will be able to sustain the tough things in change a lot more. You'll be able to recover faster. All that. So, that's what I got for you for surrendering. So I hope that made sense for people. And I hope that if you are struggling with surrendering, if you even have a different opinion of surrender, I would love to hear it, because I know a lot, but I don't know everything. And so if I need a new perspective, that's just the perspective of, in my story, of how surrendering has become impactful for my life, and why I encourage people to go inward and to reflect on like how surrendering, how you've been a perpetrator of taking, and as part of that, because that's usually the negative experience that we don't want to admit to ourselves. That's usually where the shame binds us to overworking ourselves and not feeling, because shame's a tough one. That's where vulnerability gets stuck in just accepting, well, I am how I am. Can't do anything about it. You don't have to do anything about it, but if you're not willing to, just say that. And that's where people get stuck in dynamics and get taken from, because they're willing to build, they're willing to give, but the other person's not willing to give, not only to them, but to themselves, the freedom from what keeps them stuck. So I'm gonna shut up because I said it was. And I hope that makes sense for people. Please, let me know if you have any questions. If you don't feel comfortable leaving a comment on YouTube, Facebook, send me an email, support@sarawilderlcsw.com, where you can provide feedback. And just for, I guess, purposes of marketing, you guys check out my website. I am launching my first group program. I do individual programs, which I don't write that. It's a difference between fitness and mental fitness. But my group coaching program is specifically about how you reestablish your relationship with food as your relationship with yourself. You can stay consistent, you can stay sustainable in your change for health and address chronic health issues, because it's not going to be done all in that group, but that group is the community, the centerpiece for how you cultivate change and how you need to stay connected to the people who are doing the same things that just looks different in their own lives. Okay. So healthcare providers, and mostly women right now. I will eventually be launching a men's group specifically for that, because there are differences in gender, but to be honest with you, there's really not that differences. There's a lot of differences physiologically, but those are things that you learn with getting connected to the extra resources that I have and eventually do something about. So if you're looking for that therapeutic accountability community, Fresh Perspective is launching February 26th for any females who are interested in getting started and staying involved, because we do little change for big results over time. So text me, DM me if you have any interest in starting that. I only have, I think, 2 seats left now. I just potentially filled 1. So until I clear that, there won't be, but there was 3 seats available now. But that will be starting in 10 days. So That face is more about the fact that I'm actually doing it. I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm so excited, but I'm hella nervous at the same time too, because it has taken me almost 6 years to get this in a place where it's not ready, but it's enough that it can go, and I can finally feel, and launch myself. I've done sustainable change before, and I'm still doing it. So something's got to be working, I guess. So, all right, you guys have a great Friday. I will actually not be here next week. I am taking a little bit of time off. So it will not be, wait, is that next week? Yeah, it's next week. So Friday will be next Friday. And we'll pick the conversation back then. You guys have a good Friday. I will see you in 2 weeks.